In 2023, Yellow Corporation, once one of the largest trucking companies in America, collapsed in a single weekend. 30,000 workers showed up for their shifts and found the doors locked. No warning, no severance, no farewell, just a notice posted online saying operations were ending immediately. After more than 100 years in business, the company that helped move American freight simply vanished. The trucks sat in the yards, the trailers sat on the docks, and 30,000 families suddenly found themselves without jobs overnight. This is not a story about bad luck. This is a story about a company that had every advantage, made every wrong decision, and then asked the American taxpayer to pay for the consequences. And the most damning part is that every single person inside Yellow could see it coming for 20 years. To understand what Yellow lost, you have to understand what Yellow was. Founded in 1924 in Oklahoma City as Yellow Cab Transit Company, the business began hauling freight rather than passengers almost immediately and never looked back. By the post-war boom, Yellow Freight was one of the most recognizable names on American highways. That distinctive yellow livery, bright, unmistakable everywhere, became as much a part of the interstate landscape as the highways themselves. If a dock was moving less than truckload freight anywhere in the continental United States, there was a yellow trailer somewhere in the chain. Less than truckload, LTL. That is the specific business Yellow was built on, and understanding it explains everything that followed. A full truckload carrier takes one shipper's goods and moves them point to point. Simple. LTL is different. You're moving partial loads from multiple shippers, consolidating them at terminals, sorting and redistributing across a network, and delivering pieces of dozens of different shipments to dozens of different destinations. It requires infrastructure. It requires terminals. It requires a network dense enough that freight can move efficiently from any point to any other point without sitting idle waiting for a full load. Yellow had that network. For decades, it was one of the best in the country. Thousands of drivers, hundreds of terminals, a dispatch system that could route freight across the continent with a precision that smaller competitors couldn't match. The Yellow trucks were everywhere because Yellow had built the infrastructure to put them everywhere, and that infrastructure was genuinely difficult to replicate. By the 1990s, Yellow was generating billions in revenue annually, the kind of company that analysts described as too big to fail, too embedded in the supply chain to disappear. The kind of company that seemed permanent, not because permanence was guaranteed, but because the alternative was simply unimaginable. The warning signs when they came were easy to dismiss, and Yellow dismissed every single one of them. The year is 1996. The trucking industry is deregulated, competitive, and changing fast. Yellow's leadership looks at the landscape and makes a strategic decision that will define the next 3 decades. Rather than investing in modernizing their existing network, updating terminals, improving technology, building the operational efficiency that the new competitive environment demanded, they decide to grow through acquisition. The logic was not irrational. Scale matters in LTL. A bigger network means more density, more efficiency, more pricing power. Buy the right companies and you can stitch together a network that competitors can't match. The theory was sound. The execution was catastrophic. In 2003, Yellow Corporation acquired Roadway Express for $1.5 billion. Roadway was Yellow's size, Yellow's scope, Yellow's direct competitor in the LTL market for decades. On paper, the combination created a freight giant with unmatched national coverage. In practice, it created a management nightmare that Yellow never solved. The two companies ran parallel networks, parallel terminals in the same cities, parallel dispatch systems that didn't talk to each other, parallel union contracts negotiated separately with the Teamsters, parallel cultures that had spent 50 years viewing each other as the enemy. Yellow's leadership promised to integrate them. They never did. A decade after the acquisition, drivers and dock workers from Roadway and Yellow were still operating as separate entities under the same corporate umbrella, still using different systems, still running routes that overlapped and cannibalized each other. The $1 billion Yellow spent buying Roadway should have bought them a competitive advantage. Instead, it bought them a structural problem they spent the next 20 years pretending they could solve without actually solving it. Then they did it again. In 2007, Yellow acquired U.S. Freightways for $1.37 billion. adding 6 regional carriers to an organization already struggling to digest one major acquisition. Now there were multiple parallel networks, multiple legacy systems, multiple union contracts, and a management team attempting to coordinate the whole thing, while the financial crisis of 2008 was building on the horizon. The debt load was staggering. The operational complexity was staggering. And the window to fix either one was closing fast. Any honest accounting of Yellow's collapse has to include the relationship with the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. Not because the union caused the collapse, the acquisitions caused the collapse, but because the labor cost structure that resulted from decades of negotiation made recovery nearly impossible once the debt became critical. Yellow's workforce was almost entirely unionized. Drivers, dock workers, mechanics, Teamsters throughout. This was not unusual for a legacy LTL carrier. What was unusual was the specific terms Yellow had negotiated over years of contentious bargaining and what those terms meant for the company's ability to restructure. Labor represented roughly 60% of Yellow's operating costs. In a business where margins are measured in fractions of a percent, where the difference between profit and loss is often 2 or 3 cents on every dollar of revenue, 60% labor costs left almost no room for error. Any operational inefficiency, any revenue shortfall, any unexpected cost hit the bottom line with brutal amplification because the labor base couldn't flex downward fast enough to compensate. Yellow and the Teamsters spent years in difficult negotiations over exactly this issue. The union understood the company's financial position. In 2010, facing what looked like imminent collapse, the Teamsters agreed to a 15% wage concession, a significant sacrifice from workers who were already watching their employer struggle. The concession bought Yellow time. Yellow used that time to continue paying executive bonuses and servicing debt, rather than rebuilding operational capacity. The pattern repeated: concessions extracted, time purchased, structural problems unaddressed. By the time Yellow was negotiating its final Teamsters contract in 2023, the relationship had deteriorated beyond repair. The union was being asked to accept further concessions from a company that had spent years demonstrating it would not use concessions to invest in the business. The workers had watched their wages compressed while the company's debt load grew and its service quality declined. Trust, once gone, does not return on the strength of promises from management that had broken them before. In 2020, the COVID pandemic shut down large portions of the American economy and created a crisis for companies that were already financially fragile. Yellow was as fragile as it got. Revenues collapsed. The debt that had been manageable in good times became existential in bad ones. The federal government, through the CARES Act, created a program to provide emergency loans to businesses critical to national security. Yellow received $700 million from that program. The justification was that Yellow's trucking network was essential infrastructure, that the loss of the company would create supply chain disruptions that would affect national security and economic stability. $700 million of taxpayer money to a company that had spent 2 decades making decisions that made this moment inevitable. What happened to that money is the most damning chapter in Yellow's story. Rather than using it to invest in the terminal upgrades, technology systems, and operational integration that might have actually made the company competitive, Yellow used a substantial portion to service existing debt. The structural problems that had been building since 2003 remained unaddressed. The parallel networks were still parallel. The legacy systems were still running. The operational inefficiency that was bleeding the company every single quarter continued bleeding. The government loan bought Yellow approximately 3 more years. 3 years in which management continued collecting salaries and bonuses. 3 years in which the problems everyone inside the company could identify went unsolved. 3 years that ended in August 2023 with 30,000 workers finding out through a website notice that their jobs no longer existed. The American taxpayer lost the entire $700 million. Not a dollar was recovered. While the financial story was playing out in boardrooms and bankruptcy courts, something quieter and more corrosive was happening on the docks and in the dispatch centers. Yellow's service quality was deteriorating. And in LTL freight, service quality is everything. Shippers choose LTL carriers based on a simple calculation: reliability and price. Can you pick up my freight when you say you will, deliver it when you say you will, and not damage it in transit? Yellow's answer to all three questions was getting worse through the late 2010 and into the early 2020s. On-time performance slipped. Damage claims climbed. Customer service response times lengthened. Shippers who had used Yellow for decades started routing freight to XPO, to Old Dominion, to Estes, to any carrier that could guarantee the basics Yellow was struggling to deliver. The revenue that left with those shippers never came back. Old Dominion in particular was building a reputation for exactly the operational excellence Yellow had abandoned: investment in terminals, technology, driver training, service consistency. While Yellow was servicing debt, Old Dominion was building infrastructure. While Yellow was fighting with its unions over concessions, Old Dominion was paying its workers competitively and posting industry-leading on-time numbers. The contrast was not subtle. By 2022, Old Dominion's operating ratio, the percentage of revenue consumed by operating costs, where lower is better, sat around 71%. Yellow's was pushing 96%. For every dollar Yellow brought in, 96 cents went out the door to cover costs. There was nothing left for investment, nothing left for debt service, nothing left for the kind of fundamental restructuring the company needed. You cannot cut your way to competitiveness when your cost structure is broken at the foundation. Yellow tried anyway. Terminal closures, route consolidations, headcount reductions. Each cut reduced service quality further, which reduced revenue further, which required further cuts. The spiral had no bottom. The end came in late July and early August of 2023. Yellow had been warning creditors and union officials for weeks that the situation was critical. A final attempt to restructure the Teamsters contract collapsed when the union, correctly reading that management had no credible plan for using any concessions productively, declined to offer further reductions. On July 30, 2023, Yellow Corporation ceased freight operations. The shutdown was immediate and total. Freight sitting on Yellow docks was stranded. Shippers scrambled to reroute shipments. Competitors suddenly found themselves absorbing enormous volumes of freight that Yellow had been handling. A windfall for Old Dominion, XPO, and others who had spent years building the capacity Yellow had been allowing to erode. On August 6, 2023, Yellow filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The filing listed $2.15 billion in debt and assets that had been depleted by 2 decades of underinvestment. The Yellow trucks, 12,000 of them, sat in yards across the country, waiting to be sold. The terminals, hundreds of them, entered a liquidation process that would drag on for months. 30,000 Teamsters lost their jobs without severance, without warning, without the dignity that a century of service to American commerce might have warranted. The $700 million government loan was gone. The billion-dollar roadway acquisition had delivered nothing. The $1.37 billion U.S. Freightways deal had delivered nothing. 20 years of debt? 20 years of deferred maintenance? 20 years of decisions that prioritized short-term survival over long-term competitiveness. All of it settled into the silence of empty yards and locked terminal doors. The bankruptcy auction sold Yellow's terminals and equipment across 2023 and into 2024. Old Dominion, Estes, Saia, and other carriers picked up terminal leases in markets where they wanted to expand. The Yellow paint was rolled over. The signage came down. One by one, the facilities that had been part of American freight infrastructure for decades became something else. What didn't get replaced were the 30,000 jobs. LTL is not a business where you can simply walk into a competitor's hiring process with your skills from a defunct carrier and expect to land immediately. The network knowledge, the route familiarity, the relationships with dock supervisors and dispatch managers, all of it was attached to a company that no longer existed. Some workers found positions with carriers that had absorbed Yellow's volume. Many did not. The lessons of Yellow's collapse are not complicated. They are the same lessons that Detroit Diesel taught and that every collapsed giant teaches. Debt is not a strategy. Acquisition without integration is not growth. Asking workers to absorb the cost of management failures is not restructuring. And a government loan to a company with no credible plan is not a rescue. It is a delay, and a delay is all it ever was. Yellow Corporation had 100 years of history, thousands of loyal employees, and the infrastructure of a genuine American institution. It had decades of warning that the path it was on led to this exact outcome. It had $700 million of public money and a final chance to change direction. It spent the money. It ignored the warnings. It locked the doors. The yellow trucks are still out there, repainted now, hauling freight under different names. The network yellow built over a century was real and valuable and worth preserving. The company that built it proved, in the end, that it was not.